Four police officers vanished mysteriously in 1987. Only one returned. His story shocked detectives in the basement of Millhaven Police Station, beneath decades of dust and forgotten paperwork. Detective Sarah Chen made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 4 police badges, cold to the touch. 4 sets of personal belongings that had been waiting 36 years for someone to ask the right questions. And one impossible report that would shatter everything she thought she knew about reality. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. October 15th, 2023. The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean like it had every day for the past century, wrapping the coastal town of Millhaven, Oregon, in its familiar gray embrace. Detective Sarah Chen descended into the station's basement, the wooden stairs creaking under her feet with each step. The smell hit her immediately, that mixture of old paper, damp concrete, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She was looking for case files from 1995, nothing more. A routine follow-up on a cold burglary case that had recently seen new evidence emerge. The basement fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across towers of cardboard boxes that reached toward the ceiling, like monuments to forgotten crimes. But it was box 471A that stopped her in her tracks. Unlike the others, this box wasn't covered in dust. Someone had been here recently. The tape sealing it had been carefully removed and reapplied, but Chen's trained eye caught the subtle differences in how it had been folded. Her 20 years in law enforcement had taught her to notice these details, the small signs that something wasn't quite right. Inside the box, wrapped in plastic evidence bags that crinkled like autumn leaves, were 4 police badges, each one polished to a mirror shine, as if someone had been maintaining them all these years. Officers Marcus Webb, James Rodriguez, David Park, and Jennifer Walsh. The names meant nothing to her, but the dates on the evidence tags made her blood run cold. November 18th, 1987. The day 4 experienced officers had walked out of this very building and into a mystery that would defy explanation. Chen lifted the manila folder with trembling fingers. The report inside was typed on an old manual typewriter, the letters slightly uneven, some striking darker than others. But it was the content that made her sink into the folding chair beside the box, her mouth going dry as she read. 4-officer unit responded to reports of unusual lights at Beacon Point. Only Officer Webb returned. Claims lighthouse was operational despite 1952 demolition. Subject exhibits signs of severe psychological trauma. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation and case closure. The lighthouse that shouldn't exist. Chen knew Beacon Point well. She'd walked past the empty concrete foundation dozens of times during her morning jogs along the coastal trail. There had never been a lighthouse there. At least, not in her lifetime. The old-timers in town sometimes mentioned one from the old days, but everyone knew it had been torn down decades ago. But what if everyone was wrong? The plastic evidence bags crinkled as she examined each badge more closely. Rodriguez. The name tugged at something in the back of her memory, a whisper from childhood conversations that had stopped whenever she entered the room. Her grandmother Rosa's sad smile when certain names were mentioned. The way her family had moved away from Millhaven when she was young, only returning when she was old enough to make her own choices. What if Officer James Rodriguez wasn't just another missing person? What if he was family? The fluorescent light above flickered again, and for just a moment, Chen could have sworn she heard something. A sound like distant waves crashing against rocks, even though they were 2 blocks from the ocean. The basement felt colder suddenly, and the smell she couldn't identify seemed stronger. She was about to discover that some mysteries don't stay buried. Some secrets have a way of calling to the living, demanding to be heard. And sometimes the past reaches out through time itself to grab hold of the present. But what really happened on November 15th, 1987? And why did someone want her to find this box? 3 days after discovering the evidence box, Detective Sarah Chen found herself standing on the doorstep of a small craftsman house on Maple Street, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird. The address in Officer Marcus Webb's personnel file had led her here, to a man who had carried an impossible secret for 36 years. The door opened before she could knock. Marcus Webb stood before her, 73 years old with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades. But it was the way he looked at her, as if he'd been expecting her, as if he'd been waiting all this time for someone to finally ask the right questions that made her blood run cold. "You found the box," he said simply, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of a man who'd spent years keeping quiet about things that mattered most. The inside of Webb's house felt frozen in time. Newspapers from 1987 sat carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Maps of Millhaven covered every wall. But these weren't ordinary street maps. Red pins marked locations throughout the town, connected by red string like a spider web of conspiracy. And everywhere, on tables, bookshelves, even taped to the refrigerator, were photographs of a lighthouse that wasn't supposed to exist. "They told everyone I was crazy," Webb said, settling into a worn leather armchair that faced the largest map. "Post-traumatic stress, they called it. Said I'd imagined the whole thing. But you can't imagine something this detailed for 36 years and never change your story." Chen pulled out her recording device, her hands trembling slightly. "Tell me what happened that night, Officer Webb." His eyes grew distant, looking past her toward something only he could see. "November 15th, 1987. We got the call around 10:30 p.m. Strange lights at Beacon Point, possibly smugglers using the old foundation for drop-offs. It should have been routine. Rodriguez was talking about his daughter's birthday party the next weekend. Park had just gotten engaged. Walsh was planning to apply for detective in the spring. The smell of old coffee and something medicinal, maybe eucalyptus, filled the air as Webb reached for a worn leather journal on the table beside him. His fingers, spotted with age but steady as a surgeon's, traced the cover with reverence. We drove out in 2 cars. I was with Rodriguez in the lead vehicle. The fog was thick that night, thicker than usual. By the time we reached the coastal road, visibility was maybe 10 feet. That's when we saw it. The light? The lighthouse. Webb's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, standing there like it had never been demolished. Like it had been waiting for us. The beam was rotating, sweeping across the water, and I could see a figure in the window of the keeper's quarters. Chen felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees, but the lighthouse was demolished in 1952. That's what everyone says. But I touched those walls. I walked up those stairs. I spoke to the woman inside. Webb opened the journal, revealing pages covered in meticulous sketches. The lighthouse in perfect detail, architectural drawings that showed rooms and passages that shouldn't have existed. She knew things about us. Personal things. She knew Rodriguez's daughter had been sick with pneumonia the month before. She knew Park's fiancée was pregnant, even though they hadn't told anyone yet. She knew Walsh's mother was dying of cancer. The sketches were impossibly detailed. Chen could see individual stones in the foundation, the exact pattern of rust on the iron railing, even the specific type of glass used in the beacon room. These weren't the drawings of a delusional man. They were the meticulous observations of a trained police officer. "What did she want?" Chen asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Webb's laugh held no humor. She said we had been chosen, that the lighthouse needed guardians, people to maintain the balance between what is and what could be. She showed us rooms underground, passages that led deeper into the earth than should have been possible. And she showed us others. Others? People from different times. I saw a man in a Union Army uniform writing in a ledger, a woman in 1920s clothing tending to some kind of machinery that hummed with electricity that hadn't been invented yet. They all looked up when we entered. like they recognized us. Chen's mouth went dry. What happened to the other officers? They stayed. Webb's voice cracked slightly. She said they had work to do, important work. That time was fragile around Beacon Point and needed constant maintenance. Rodriguez looked at me just before I left and said, "Tell my family I'm doing something important. Tell them I'll see them again." "But you left. Why?" Webb closed the journal, his hands shaking now. Someone had to remember. Someone had to tell the story. She said I was the messenger, the one who would wait for the right person to continue the work. He looked directly at Chen, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. She said I would know when that person arrived. Outside, the fog was beginning to roll in from the ocean, and through Webb's window, Chen could swear she saw lights moving in patterns that didn't match any ships she knew. What if Marcus Webb wasn't crazy? What if he was the sanest person in Millhaven? Detective Sarah. Chen sat in her car outside her grandmother's house for 20 minutes before she found the courage to knock. The small adobe-style home on the outskirts of Millhaven looked exactly as it had during her childhood visits. Terracotta pots filled with marigolds lining the walkway, the scent of cinnamon and coffee drifting through the screen door. But now, with Officer James Rodriguez's badge burning a hole in her jacket pocket, everything felt different. Rosa Delgado answered the door with flour-dusted hands and a smile that faltered the moment she saw Chen's expression. At 82, her grandmother still moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to carry heavy secrets without letting them show. "Mija," Rosa whispered, her dark eyes searching Chen's face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have, Abuela." Chen pulled the evidence bag from her pocket, watching as her grandmother's face went pale at the sight of the badge. "We need to talk about Uncle James." The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of an old wall clock and the distant sound of waves against the shore. Rosa sank into her favorite chair at the small dining table, the same one where she had served Chen countless meals during childhood summers. But those meals had always been punctuated by careful silences, conversations that stopped when certain names were mentioned. "I always knew this day would come," Rosa said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I prayed it wouldn't, but I knew." She traced the edge of the plastic evidence bag with one trembling finger. "James always said the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it." Chen pulled out her recording device, but Rosa shook her head firmly. "No recordings. Some stories are too dangerous to preserve that way. Sit close, Emilia. Listen with your heart, not just your ears." The afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains cast shadows that seemed to dance as Rosa began to speak. "James wasn't just your uncle. He was my baby brother, 10 years younger than your mother. He became a police officer because he believed in protecting people, in finding the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made others." What was he investigating at Beacon Point? Rosa stood slowly, walking to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room. From inside, she pulled out a manila envelope, its edges worn soft with age. James had been tracking something for months before he disappeared. Ships that appeared on no manifests, cargo that left no customs records. But it wasn't drugs or weapons, like everyone assumed. She spread old photographs across the table, black and white images of the lighthouse from different decades, but all showing it intact and operational. James had found evidence that people were using Beacon Point as more than just a smuggling route. They were bringing things through that shouldn't exist. People from different times, objects that hadn't been invented yet. Chen felt the room spin slightly. "That's impossible, Abuela. Is it?" Rosa's eyes held a knowing sadness. "Your uncle documented everything. He found customs logs from the 1920s that mentioned cargo from ships that wouldn't be built until the 1950s. He found immigration records of people arriving in Millhaven who spoke languages that linguists couldn't identify. And he found death certificates for people who were buried decades before they were born." The photographs showed the lighthouse in various states, sometimes gleaming white and new, sometimes weathered and ancient, but always there. In one image from 1943, Chen could clearly see figures standing in the beacon room, their faces too distant to make out, but their postures suggesting they were watching something on the horizon. The night James disappeared, Rosa continued, he came here for dinner. He was excited, nervous. He said he was close to understanding something big, something that could change how people thought about time and reality itself. He showed me this. From the envelope, Rosa pulled out a letter written in James's careful handwriting. The date at the top read, November 14th, 1987, one day before the incident. Rosa, Chen read aloud, if something happens to me tomorrow night, I need you to know that I wasn't investigating smugglers. I was investigating guardians, people who have been protecting something at Beacon Point for over a century. The lighthouse isn't just a building, it's a doorway. And tomorrow night, that door is going to open. Chen's hands shook as she continued reading. I've been chosen to help them, Rosa. I don't fully understand what that means yet, but I know it's important. More important than anything I've ever done. If I don't come back, tell Sophia that her papa is doing work that matters, work that protects her and everyone else. Tell her I love her more than all the stars in the sky. Rosa wiped tears from her eyes with a dish towel that smelled like her famous tamales. Sophia was only 7 when James disappeared. The family moved away because we couldn't bear the whispers, the theories, the constant questions. We told everyone James had been killed in the line of duty and buried the truth with our grief. But you kept his research. James made me promise to keep it safe, to give it to the right person when the time came. I've been waiting 36 years for someone to ask the right questions. Rosa reached across the table and took Chen's hands in her own. You have his eyes, Mija, his determination, his need to protect others, even when it costs him everything. Through the kitchen window, Chen could see the fog beginning to roll in from the ocean, and somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the sound of a foghorn, even though there was no lighthouse to sound it. Abuela, she whispered, what if Uncle James is still out there? What if he's been waiting for someone to find him? Rosa squeezed her hands tightly. Then you better be very careful about what you go looking for, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But was Chen looking for the truth, or was the truth looking for her? Dr. Elena Vasquez had seen her share of strange phenomena during her 15 years as a quantum physicist at Portland State University. But the photographs Detective Chen spread across her laboratory table made her question everything she thought she understood about the nature of reality. These electromagnetic readings, Vasquez murmured, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she studied Webb's journal entries, they're not just unusual, they're impossible. The energy signatures suggest localized gravitational distortions that should collapse into themselves within nanoseconds. Chen watched as the physicist's excitement grew with each page. Dr. Vasquez was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with prematurely silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of intense focus that came from spending years peering into the fundamental mysteries of existence. The laboratory hummed with the quiet efficiency of expensive equipment. Computers displaying complex waveform patterns cast blue light across workbenches covered with instruments Chen couldn't begin to identify. But it was the smell, ozone and metal, like the air before a lightning strike, that made her skin prickle with anticipation. Officer Webb documented these readings over decades? Vasquez asked, pulling up a chair and spreading Webb's sketches alongside her own research papers. Every month during specific lunar phases. He's been taking readings at Beacon Point with equipment he bought with his own pension money. Chen pointed to a series of graphs Webb had meticulously hand-drawn. He says the electromagnetic activity peaks during astronomical alignments. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, cross-referencing Webb's data with something on her computer screen. When she finally spoke, Her voice carried the wonder of someone who had just glimpsed something extraordinary. Detective Chen, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound like science fiction, but I need you to understand. The mathematics here are sound. She pulled up a complex equation that covered half her monitor. Webb's readings suggest the presence of what we call closed time-like curves, essentially, loops in space-time where cause and effect become fluid. In English, please, time isn't linear at Beacon Point. Under specific conditions, past, present, and future might exist simultaneously in the same location. Vasquez stood and began pacing, her excitement building. It's theoretical physics made real. The lighthouse your witnesses describe could exist in 1987 while simultaneously being demolished in 1952. Both states would be equally true. Chen felt that familiar chill run down her spine. You're saying Webb isn't crazy. I'm saying Webb might have documented the greatest scientific discovery in human history. Vasquez pulled out a tablet and began sketching rapidly. Look, imagine time as a river. Normally, it flows in one direction. But at certain geographic locations, under specific gravitational and electromagnetic conditions, you can create eddies, places where the water swirls back on itself. The physicist's enthusiasm was infectious, but Chen couldn't shake the image of her uncle's face in that final photograph Rosa had shown her. What would happen to someone who entered one of these eddies? That's the million-dollar question. Vasquez's expression grew serious. Theoretically, they could move between different temporal states. They might experience all possible timelines simultaneously, or become unstuck from linear time entirely. They could be everywhere and everywhen at once. Outside the laboratory windows, Chen could see storm clouds gathering over the Pacific. The afternoon light was fading earlier than usual, and she found herself thinking about Webb, sitting alone in his house, surrounded by 36 years of careful observations. Dr. Vasquez, I need you to come to Beacon Point with me, tonight. The physicist looked up from her calculations, her eyes bright with scientific curiosity, warring against practical caution. Detective, if even half of this data is accurate, approaching the site during an active temporal distortion could be extremely dangerous. People are missing. My uncle is missing. If there's even a chance they're still alive, trapped in some kind of time loop, I have to try to help them. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, studying the readouts on her equipment. The humming of the machines seemed to grow louder, and Chen noticed that several displays were showing energy spikes that hadn't been there moments before. There's something else, Vasquez said slowly. I've been monitoring unusual electromagnetic activity along the Oregon coast for my research. The patterns have been intensifying over the past few weeks. She pulled up a map on her computer, showing the coastline dotted with pulsing red indicators. All of these anomalies are centered on locations where lighthouses once stood. Chen leaned closer to the screen. All of them? Every single one. And, Detective, they're all built on sites that were sacred to indigenous peoples, places the original inhabitants considered to be thresholds between worlds. Vasquez's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What if the lighthouses weren't just built on these locations by coincidence? What if they were built to control something that was already there? The equipment in the laboratory began beeping rapidly, and several monitors displayed warning messages Chen couldn't read. Vasquez moved quickly between her instruments, her face growing pale as she checked readings. Dr. Vasquez, what's happening? The electromagnetic activity at Beacon Point just spiked beyond anything Webb ever recorded. Whatever's happening there, it's happening now. She grabbed a portable detector from her equipment rack, its display flashing urgent red warnings. Detective, if we're going to do this, we need to go immediately. The next astronomical alignment is in 3 hours, and if my calculations are correct, tonight might be our only chance to find your uncle. Chen felt her heart race as she watched the scientist gather her equipment. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that she was chasing fantasies based on the ravings of a traumatized old man. But the detective in her, the part that had learned to trust her instincts over the years, knew they were on the verge of something unprecedented. "One more thing," Vasquez said as they prepared to leave the laboratory. "If we encounter the temporal distortion, if we actually see the lighthouse that shouldn't exist, we need to be prepared for the possibility that we might not be able to return to our own timeline." Chen thought about Rebecca waiting for her at home, about the normal life she'd built in Millhaven, about all the reasons she should walk away from this investigation. But then she thought about her Uncle James, writing his final letter before walking into the unknown to protect people he'd never meet. What if the missing officers weren't lost at all? What if they were exactly where they needed to be? The rain had started by the time Detective Chen and Dr. Vasquez reached the tribal community center. Fat drops that struck the windshield like bullets and turned the October evening into a wall of gray. Margaret Rainsong waited for them in the doorway, her weathered face etched with concern that seemed to go deeper than the approaching storm. "You shouldn't have come here tonight," the tribal elder said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 73 years listening to the land's warnings. "The spirits are restless. Can't you feel it?" Chen could. The air itself seemed charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm overhead. Dr. Vasquez's portable detector hadn't stopped beeping since they'd entered Millhaven's city limits, its readings climbing steadily as they approached the reservation. Inside the community center, cedar smoke drifted from a small ceremonial fire, mixing with the smell of rain and something Chen couldn't identify. Something ancient and wild that made her think of deep forests and older gods. Margaret gestured for them to sit at a wooden table carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the firelight. "My grandfather was the last keeper of the old lighthouse," Margaret began, her hands folded carefully in front of her. "Not the keeper the Coast Guard appointed, the real keeper, the one chosen by the land itself. His name was Joseph Rainsong, and he understood what that place truly was." Chen pulled out her notebook, but Margaret shook her head. "Some knowledge isn't meant to be written down, Detective. Some truths live only in the telling, passed from voice to voice, like sacred fire." Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her scientific mind clearly wrestling with the mystical nature of Margaret's words. "Mrs. Rainsong, Officer Webb's readings suggest unusual electromagnetic phenomena at Beacon Point. Could your grandfather's records help us understand? Your machines can measure the symptoms." Margaret interrupted gently, "But they cannot see the cause. Beacon Point isn't just a location, Doctor. It's a threshold, a place where the membrane between worlds grows thin during certain celestial alignments." The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling toward the ceiling, and Chen noticed that the shadows on the walls seemed to move independently of the flames. Margaret reached into a beaded pouch at her side and withdrew a bundle of sage and sweetgrass, lighting it from the fire. "My people have known about the threshold for 1,000 years. We called it the place where time bends. Why, sis, and we understood that it required guardians, people willing to sacrifice their linear existence to maintain the balance between what is and what could be." The smoke from the burning sage made Chen's eyes water, but also seemed to clear her mind in a way she couldn't explain. These guardians, were they volunteers? Sometimes the threshold chose them, called to them in dreams or visions. My grandfather said the land could sense those with the right frequency, people whose spirits could exist in multiple times without losing themselves. Dr. Vasquez consulted her tablet, cross-referencing something with her readings. The electromagnetic signatures we're detecting, they match the brainwave patterns associated with certain meditative states, as if the location itself induces a specific type of consciousness. Margaret nodded approvingly. "Your science is beginning to catch up with our ancient knowledge, Doctor. The threshold doesn't just bend time, it bends awareness. Those who enter become capable of perceiving all possible timelines simultaneously. Chen thought about her uncle's final letter, about his certainty that he was doing important work. What kind of work do these guardians do? The tribal elder's expression grew grave. They maintain the barriers between realities. Without them, the threshold would expand, consuming first the town, then the state, eventually the entire continent. Time would become fluid everywhere. Causality would collapse, and reality as we know it would unravel. Outside, the storm was intensifying, but Chen could hear something underneath the thunder. A sound like distant bells, or maybe voices singing in harmonies that human throats shouldn't be able to produce. The lighthouse, Margaret continued, was built by people who understood the threshold's power but wanted to control it rather than serve it. They thought they could harness the temporal distortions for their own purposes. What they created instead was a focal point, a structure that amplified the natural phenomena beyond safe levels. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her tablet, her face pale in the firelight. The readings are spiking again. Whatever's happening at Beacon Point, it's accelerating. Margaret stood abruptly, walking to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, Chen could see lights moving on the horizon. Not the steady beam of ships, but something that pulsed in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The alignment is beginning early, Margaret whispered. The threshold is calling for new guardians. It has been waiting 36 years for the right people to answer. Chen felt something cold settle in her stomach. What do you mean, the right people? Detective Rodriguez was chosen because of his connection to you, a bloodline that carries the frequency the threshold recognizes. Officer Webb was chosen as the messenger, the one who would wait and watch and prepare the way. Dr. Vasquez was chosen for her understanding of the scientific principles underlying the phenomenon. The physicist stood slowly, her equipment now screaming warnings that filled the room with urgent electronic noise. And Detective Chen? Margaret turned from the window, her eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. Detective Chen was chosen because she carries her uncle's dedication to protecting others, but also something he lacked: the ability to bridge worlds, to exist simultaneously in the realm of logic and the realm of mystery. The sound of singing was growing louder now, harmonizing with the storm in ways that made the building's wooden frame creak and groan. Chen could see her own breath in the suddenly cold air, and the symbols carved into the table seemed to glow with their own inner light. Mrs. Rainsong, Chen said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. What happens if we refuse? What happens if we don't go to the lighthouse? The tribal elder's smile held infinite sadness. Then the threshold will choose others. It will keep choosing until it finds guardians willing to make the sacrifice. But detective, the window is closing. In less than 2 hours the alignment will be complete, and the opportunity to save your uncle and his colleagues will be lost for another 36 years. Dr. Vasquez was frantically checking her readings, her scientific training warring with growing acceptance of something beyond rational explanation. The energy levels are approaching critical mass. If we're going to do this, we need to leave now. Chen looked out at the storm, at the impossible lights dancing on the horizon, and thought about all the people who had disappeared at Beacon Point over the years. All the families who had never gotten answers, never found closure. But what if the missing people weren't victims at all? What if they were heroes, sacrificed themselves to protect a reality that would never know it needed protecting? Mrs. Rainsong, Chen said, standing and checking her service weapon. If we do this, if we become guardians, do we ever get to come home? The tribal elder's expression was unreadable in the flickering light. Home isn't a place, detective. It's a purpose. And some purposes are bigger than any one lifetime. Was Chen walking toward her destiny or toward her doom? The black sedan appeared in Detective Chen's rearview mirror as she and Dr. Vasquez left the reservation, its headlights cutting through the storm like predatory eyes. It followed them for 3 miles before the red and blue lights began flashing, forcing Chen to pull over on the rain-slicked coastal highway with her heart hammering against her ribs. Agent Thompson emerged from the sedan wearing a perfectly pressed suit that somehow remained dry despite the torrential rain. He was younger than Chen had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of bland, forgettable face that screamed federal training. But it was his eyes that made her blood run cold. They held the flat, emotionless stare of someone who had seen too much and felt too little. "Detective Chen, Dr. Vasquez." He approached their vehicle with measured steps, one hand resting casually on something beneath his jacket. "I'm Agent Thompson with the Specialized Research Division of the Department of Homeland Security. I need you both to step out of the vehicle." Chen's hand moved instinctively toward her service weapon. "Let me see some identification first." Thompson produced credentials that looked authentic, though Chen noticed the agency name was deliberately vague. Department of Anomalous Phenomena Research, the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that was designed to sound official while revealing nothing. "Detective, you and Dr. Vasquez have been investigating matters of national security without proper clearance. I'm here to ensure this stops immediately." His voice carried the monotone authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Dr. Vasquez rolled down her passenger window, her portable detector still beeping frantically in her lap. "Agent Thompson, the electromagnetic phenomena at Beacon Point represent a significant scientific discovery. Any interference could endanger countless lives," Thompson interrupted. "Dr. Vasquez, your academic credentials are impressive, but you're operating outside your area of expertise. Some discoveries are too dangerous for civilian oversight." Chen stepped out of her vehicle, the rain immediately soaking through her jacket. Something about Thompson's presence made the storm feel colder, more hostile. "How long has your agency known about Beacon Point?" "Long enough to understand the risks involved." Thompson moved closer, and Chen caught the scent of ozone and something metallic, the same smell that had filled Dr. Vasquez's laboratory. "The phenomena you're investigating has been under federal monitoring since 1952. The lighthouse was demolished for reasons of national security. But people are still disappearing. Acceptable losses in service of a greater good." Thompson's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something that might have been regret, or might have been satisfaction. "Detective, your investigation ends here. Dr. Vasquez will return to Portland and resume her normal research. You will close the Rodriguez case and file it under death by misadventure." Chen felt anger flare in her chest. "My uncle didn't die by misadventure. He was investigating something you people wanted to keep hidden. Your uncle was a dedicated officer who stumbled into matters beyond his understanding. His sacrifice, along with that of his colleagues, has prevented catastrophic damage to the fabric of reality itself." Dr. Vasquez emerged from the passenger side, her detector now screaming warnings that made conversation difficult. Thompson glanced at the device with what looked like practiced familiarity. "The alignment is accelerating beyond our projections," he said, almost to himself. "The subjects are becoming more active." "Subjects?" Chen stepped closer, rain dripping from her hair. "You're talking about the missing officers like they're lab rats. I'm talking about volunteers who understood the importance of their mission." Thompson's mask slipped slightly, revealing something underneath. Exhaustion, maybe, or the weight of terrible knowledge. "Detective, the threshold at Beacon Point isn't just a local anomaly. It's one of 17 similar sites worldwide, all requiring constant maintenance to prevent temporal collapse." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Chen felt the world tilt slightly, her understanding of reality shifting once again. "You've been using people as guardians," Dr. Vasquez whispered, her scientific mind immediately grasping the implications. "Creating a network of human anchors to stabilize temporal distortions." Thompson said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. Irishami de diet Haninatrana tree. How many? Chen demanded. How many people have you sacrificed for your experiments? Not experiments. Emergency containment protocols. Thompson's voice carried the strain of someone who had justified terrible decisions for too long. The threshold phenomena began manifesting globally in 1881, coinciding with increased industrial development and electromagnetic interference. Without intervention, reality would have unraveled completely by 1920. The rain seemed to intensify, and Chen noticed that the streetlights along the highway were flickering in patterns that matched the rhythm of Dr. Vasquez's detector. The storm itself seemed to be responding to whatever was happening at Beacon Point. The missing officers, Chen said slowly. They're not trapped. They're working for you. They're working for humanity's survival, Thompson corrected. The consciousness translation process allows them to exist simultaneously across multiple timelines, monitoring and adjusting temporal distortions that could cascade into global catastrophe. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her equipment, her face pale in the lightning-illuminated darkness. Agent Thompson, the energy readings are approaching critical levels. If the threshold destabilizes during tonight's alignment, then new Guardians will be recruited to restore balance. Thompson's gaze fixed on Chen with uncomfortable intensity. The threshold has a way of calling to those with the right psychological and genetic markers. Your family line has been flagged for recruitment since your uncle's integration. Chen felt something cold settle in her stomach. Integration? The process by which human consciousness becomes distributed across multiple temporal states. It's painless, Detective, and those who undergo integration report a sense of purpose beyond anything they experienced in linear existence. The federal agent stepped closer, and Chen could see her own reflection in his unnaturally calm eyes. You've been chosen, Detective Chen. The threshold has been calling to you for months. The dreams, the sense of something missing, the compulsion to investigate this case despite clear warnings to stop. Chen's hand tightened on her weapon, though she wasn't sure what good it would do against someone who casually discussed manipulating reality itself. And if I refuse, then the threshold will select others. But the window for voluntary integration closes in 90 minutes. After that, the selection process becomes less predictable. Thunder crashed overhead, and in the brief moment of illumination, Chen could swear she saw figures standing in the rain. Translucent shapes that might have been people, or might have been tricks of light and shadow. Detective, Dr. Vasquez whispered urgently, we need to make a decision. The threshold is calling for stabilization, and if we don't respond willingly... Thompson nodded grimly. The threshold will take what it needs, when it needs it. The only choice you have is whether you go as volunteers or conscripts. Chen looked out toward Beacon Point, where impossible lights danced in the storm, and thought about her Uncle James walking into the unknown to protect people he would never meet. But what if Thompson was lying? What if the federal government wasn't protecting humanity, but exploiting something they didn't understand? And what if Chen was about to become the next victim in a conspiracy that stretched back over a century? Detective Chen stood at the edge of Beacon Point, the wind whipping her hair across her face as she stared at the empty concrete foundation that had haunted her dreams for weeks. Dr. Vasquez crouched beside her portable equipment, the devices screaming warnings that were barely audible above the storm's fury. But it was the silence from Agent Thompson, standing 10 feet behind them with his hand resting on his concealed weapon, that made Chen's skin crawl with anticipation. 60 minutes until peak alignment, Vasquez announced, her voice tight with scientific fascination and human terror. The electromagnetic readings are unlike anything I've ever recorded. It's as if reality itself is becoming negotiable. Chen could feel it too, a sensation like standing on the edge of a cliff while the ground beneath her feet slowly crumbled away. The air tasted of copper and ozone, and every breath seemed to carry whispers in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Detective," Thompson called over the wind, "you're running out of time to make this choice voluntarily. The threshold doesn't wait for human hesitation." But Chen wasn't listening to the federal agent anymore. She was hearing something else, a sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground, rising through the cracked concrete foundation like the echo of distant voices, familiar voices. Sarah. The whisper was so faint she almost missed it, carried on a gust of wind that smelled like her grandmother's kitchen and her uncle's cologne. "Sarah, we're here." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her equipment, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. "Detective, the temporal distortion is beginning to manifest. I'm detecting multiple timeline convergences centered on this exact location." The empty foundation began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. For just a moment, Chen could swear she saw the outline of stone walls, the suggestion of a lighthouse that existed in the spaces between seconds. "Uncle James?" she whispered, stepping closer to the foundation's edge. Thompson moved forward urgently. "Detective Chen, don't enter the distortion field without proper preparation. The integration process requires—" "Integration?" Chen spun to face him, her hand moving to her service weapon. "You keep using that word like it's something voluntary. What really happens to the people who become guardians?" The federal agent's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "They serve a purpose greater than individual existence. They become part of something larger, more important than any single human life." "That's not an answer." Chen's voice carried the authority of 20 years in law enforcement. "What happens to their consciousness? Do they maintain their personalities, their memories, their humanity?" Dr. Vasquez stood slowly, her portable detector now producing a sound like electronic screaming. "Agent Thompson, the energy readings suggest that human consciousness exposed to these temporal fields undergoes fundamental alteration. Are you talking about preserving human awareness or converting it into something else entirely?" Thunder crashed overhead, but beneath the sound, Chen heard it again. Voices calling her name, but not just her uncle's voice now. She could hear Officer Webb, younger and stronger than the broken man she'd met. She could hear other voices, too. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stretching back through decades of missing persons and unexplained disappearances. "They're not guardians," she realized, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "They're prisoners. You've been feeding people to this thing for over a century, and you've convinced yourself it's for the greater good." Thompson's hand tightened on his weapon. "Detective, you don't understand the scope of what we're dealing with. Without constant human consciousness to anchor the temporal distortions, reality itself would— Would what?" Chen stepped closer to him, her own weapon now drawn. "Collapse? Or would it just stop being controllable by people like you?" The shimmer above the foundation was becoming more solid, and Chen could definitely see walls now, stone blocks fitted together with impossible precision, climbing toward a beacon room that pulsed with light that hurt to look at directly. The lighthouse that shouldn't exist was manifesting in their reality, called into being by the approaching astronomical alignment. "Sarah!" The voice was clearer now, definitely her Uncle James. "Don't trust him. The Guardians aren't protecting reality. They're being harvested to power something that should never have been built." Dr. Vasquez gasped, pointing at her readings. "The electromagnetic signature? It's not natural. This isn't a natural temporal phenomenon. Someone built this. Someone created a machine that feeds on human consciousness." Agent Thompson raised his weapon, his mask of federal authority finally slipping to reveal something desperate and frightened underneath. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. The project has been containing this anomaly for 70 years. Without constant feeding, it will expand beyond our ability to control." "Feeding?" Chen felt sick to her stomach. "You're talking about people like they're fuel for your machine. Willing volunteers who understood the stakes." Thompson's voice cracked with the strain of justifying decades of horror. "People who chose to sacrifice their individual existence for humanity's survival. The lighthouse was becoming more solid by the moment, and Chen could see figures moving in its windows, translucent shapes that might have been her uncle, might have been the other missing officers, might have been the hundreds of people who had disappeared at sites like this around the world. They didn't choose anything, she said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. You've been lying to them, telling them they were heroes while you fed them to a machine that converts human consciousness into energy. Dr. Vasquez was frantically taking readings, her scientific mind trying to process the impossible. Agent Thompson, if this is an artificial construct designed to harvest consciousness, then the temporal distortions aren't side effects. They're the collection mechanism. You've built a trap that exists outside linear time. Thompson's weapon was shaking now, and Chen realized he wasn't just desperate, he was terrified. The project is bigger than any of us. There are forces involved that go beyond human understanding. If we don't maintain the feeding schedule— Whose schedule? Chen demanded. Who's really running this project? Because you don't seem like someone in charge. You seem like someone who's scared of his own bosses. The federal agent's eyes darted toward the lighthouse, which was now solid enough to cast shadows in the lightning flashes. The original architects of the project. They're not entirely human anymore. The integration process works both ways. Feed enough consciousness into the machine, and eventually, the machine develops its own awareness. Chen felt the world spin around her. You're saying the lighthouse is alive? I'm saying it's hungry, Thompson whispered. And it's been getting smarter every year, learning to manipulate the selection process, calling to specific individuals who meet its feeding requirements. The voices from the lighthouse were getting stronger now, and Chen could make out individual words, pleas for help, warnings about the trap, descriptions of a existence that was neither life nor death, but something far worse. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her equipment, her face pale with understanding. Detective, the alignment peaks in 30 minutes. If we're going to stop this, we need to act now. But I need you to understand. Approaching that structure could mean losing yourself forever. Chen looked at the lighthouse, at Agent Thompson's terrified face, at the readings that proved decades of government-sanctioned horror. She thought about her Uncle James, trapped somewhere between existence and oblivion, and all the other victims who had been lied to about their heroic sacrifice. Dr. Vasquez, she said quietly, is there a way to shut it down, to free the people trapped inside? The physicist's expression was grim. Theoretically, disrupting the power source during peak alignment could cause a cascade failure. But, Detective, if the machine fails catastrophically, everyone trapped inside might be lost forever. But what if that was better than an eternity of being harvested for energy by something that had learned to masquerade as salvation? The lighthouse door materialized before Detective Chen could decide whether to approach it, appearing like a photograph developing in slow motion. The heavy oak wood bore intricate carvings that seemed to shift in the lightning flashes, symbols that hurt to look at directly, but spoke to something deep in her unconscious mind. Dr. Vasquez grabbed her arm. Detective, my readings show massive temporal distortion around that entrance. Crossing the threshold could scatter your consciousness across multiple timelines. But Chen was already walking forward, drawn by voices that grew clearer with each step. Her uncle's voice, yes, but also others. Officer Webb, young and desperate. Officer Walsh, pleading for someone to understand. Dozens more, maybe hundreds. Their words overlapping in a chorus of warning and welcome. Agent Thompson shouted something behind her, but his words were lost in the sound of waves that crashed against rocks that existed in a different century. The smell of salt air mixed with burning whale oil and something else, the metallic scent of electricity that wouldn't be invented for decades after the lighthouse was built. The door swung open at her touch. Inside, the lighthouse defied every law of physics Chen understood. The circular room was impossibly vast, its walls stretching upward into darkness that swallowed her flashlight beam. Staircases spiraled in directions that should have intersected but somehow didn't, and doorways opened onto rooms that couldn't exist in the same structure. But it was the woman standing at the center of the chaos that made Chen's breath catch in her throat. She looked maybe 40, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and clothes that seemed to belong to every era and none. A Victorian-style dress with modern boots, a lab coat over a medieval apron. But it was her, eyes that stopped Chen cold. They held the depth of someone who had seen centuries pass like seasons, who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations from outside the flow of linear time. "Detective Chen," the woman said, her voice carrying accents from a dozen different eras. "I've been waiting for you to arrive, though I must confess, I hoped you would come to a different conclusion about our work here. You're," the lighthouse keeper Webb described. "I am many things, to many people across many times," the woman gestured, "to the impossible architecture around them. To some, I am a savior. To others, a jailer. To the federal agents who believe they control this operation, I am a useful tool. But to you, detective, I hope to be something more honest." Chen kept her weapon drawn, though she wasn't sure what good it would do in a place where cause and effect seemed negotiable. "Agent Thompson says you're a machine that feeds on human consciousness." The woman's laugh held genuine amusement. "Agent Thompson understands very little about what he serves. Yes, this structure harvests consciousness, but not to feed some mechanical appetite. It harvests consciousness to preserve it." Dr. Vasquez appeared in the doorway behind Chen, her portable detector screaming warnings that echoed strangely in the vast space. "The temporal readings are off the charts. Detective, this entire structure exists in a state of quantum superposition. It's everywhere and everywhen at once." "Dr. Vasquez," the keeper said warmly, as if greeting an old friend, "your understanding of quantum mechanics is impressive, but you're thinking too small. This isn't just quantum superposition. It's consciousness superposition. Every person who enters this lighthouse doesn't lose their individual awareness. They gain access to all possible versions of themselves across all possible timelines." Chen felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're saying the missing people are still alive?" "Alive, dead, never born, living different lives in different realities. They are all of these simultaneously." The keeper moved toward one of the impossible staircases, and Chen could see figures standing on the steps above. Translucent people who flickered between different ages, different clothes, different versions of themselves. Your Uncle James, for instance, is experiencing the timeline where he never became a police officer, where he moved to Seattle and became a teacher. But he's also experiencing the timeline where he died in infancy, and the timeline where he lived to be 97, and thousands of others. Dr. Vasquez lowered her detector, her scientific mind struggling to process the implications. But consciousness can't exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously. The human mind would fragment under that kind of cognitive load. Individual human consciousness, yes, the keeper agreed. But collective consciousness, consciousness that has been expanded beyond the boundaries of single identity, can encompass infinite possibilities. The people you call missing haven't been destroyed, Doctor. They've been liberated from the prison of linear existence. Chen thought about Officer Webb, sitting alone in his house for 36 years, surrounded by maps and photographs of a lighthouse that shouldn't exist. Then why is Webb still in his normal timeline? Why didn't he stay here with the others? The keeper's expression grew sad. Because someone needed to serve as an anchor point, a connection between this expanded reality and your linear one. Marcus Webb volunteered to remain partially integrated, experiencing just enough of the quantum consciousness to remember and document, but staying grounded in singular time to serve as our messenger. Messenger for what? To find the people who could help us solve the real problem. The keeper gestured toward a doorway that hadn't been there moments before. "Detective, What Agent Thompson doesn't understand is that we're not the threat to reality. We're trying to prevent one. Through the doorway, Chen could see a room filled with equipment that seemed to blend technologies from different centuries. Brass clockwork mechanisms connected to quantum computers, steam-powered engines driving particle accelerators. And working at these impossible machines were figures she recognized from the missing persons files. Dozens of people from different eras, all working together on some incomprehensible project. The temporal distortions that began manifesting in 1881 weren't natural phenomena, the Keeper continued. They were symptoms of damage being done to the fabric of space-time itself. Industrial development, nuclear testing, quantum experiments. Humanity has been poking holes in reality for over a century, and those holes are growing. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. You're saying human technological development is destabilizing the fundamental structure of existence? I'm saying that linear time is an artificial construct, maintained by conscious observation and belief. The more humanity develops technologies that treat time as a resource to be manipulated, atomic clocks precise to nanoseconds, GPS satellites that require relativistic corrections, quantum computers that exist in superposition, the more we weaken the barriers between timelines. Chen felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. And the lighthouse, the machine, it's not harvesting consciousness. It's trying to repair the damage by creating stable anchor points in space-time? Exactly. But the work requires consciousness that can exist outside linear time, awareness that can perceive and interact with multiple realities simultaneously. We've been recruiting people with the right mental flexibility to join our efforts. The room filled with the sound of voices, not the desperate pleas Chen had expected, but something closer to a conversation. Hundreds of voices discussing complex problems, sharing solutions, working together across time and space to fix something broken in the fundamental nature of existence itself. Your Uncle James, the Keeper said gently, he understood what we were offering. The chance to be part of something larger than individual existence, to help preserve not just humanity, but the very concept of coherent reality. Chen looked around the impossible lighthouse, at the figures working in rooms that defied physics, at the evidence of a conspiracy that was trying to save the world rather than exploit it. But Agent Thompson's terrified face lingered in her memory, along with his warning about forces beyond human understanding. If this work is so important, she asked, why all the secrecy? Why the federal cover-up? The Keeper's expression darkened. Because there are others who want to use the temporal instabilities for their own purposes. The federal project Agent Thompson represents, they don't want to repair the damage to space-time. They want to weaponize it. Was Chen looking at humanity's salvation or its most sophisticated lie? The explosion of gunfire from outside the lighthouse shattered the ethereal calm of the Keeper's explanation. Detective Chen spun toward the entrance as Agent Thompson's voice cut through the storm, amplified by what sounded like military-grade communication equipment. This is Agent Thompson requesting immediate extraction protocol. The subjects have made contact with the anomaly. Initiate containment procedures immediately. Dr. Vasquez grabbed Chen's arm, her portable detector now screaming warnings that made conversation nearly impossible. Detective, massive electromagnetic surge incoming. Multiple aircraft approaching from the south. Through the lighthouse's impossible windows, Chen could see lights in the sky. Not the random patterns of civilian aircraft, but the precise formation flight of military helicopters. Black shapes against the storm clouds, moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of extensive planning and unlimited resources. The lighthouse keeper's expression shifted from welcoming to deeply concerned. They're early. The federal project wasn't supposed to activate containment protocols for another 15 minutes. Containment protocols? Chen kept her weapon ready, though she was beginning to understand that the real threat wasn't inside the lighthouse, it was landing outside. What exactly are they trying to contain? Us, came a familiar voice from the staircase behind her. Chen turned to see her Uncle James descending the steps, but not as she remembered him from childhood photographs. This version of James Rodriguez flickered between different ages, sometimes the young officer she'd seen in police files, sometimes middle-aged, sometimes elderly with silver hair and laugh lines around his eyes. But in all his variations, his expression carried the same determined compassion she remembered. "Sarah," he said, his voice somehow carrying decades of accumulated wisdom, "the federal project has been using our work to develop weapons that can destabilize enemy nations by fracturing their timeline coherence. They want to turn temporal manipulation into a tool of war." Outside, the sound of helicopters grew louder, accompanied by the mechanical whining of equipment being deployed. Through the lighthouse's walls, which seemed to be transparent from this side, Chen could see figures in hazmat suits setting up devices that looked like a cross between radar arrays and particle accelerators. "They're positioning temporal dampening fields," the keeper said urgently. "If they activate those devices during peak astronomical alignment, they'll trap everyone currently experiencing quantum consciousness in a single timeline. The shock of forced linear existence will destroy their minds." Dr. Vasquez was frantically taking readings, her scientific training warring with growing panic. "The energy, signatures from those devices. They're designed to collapse quantum superposition by brute force. Anyone caught in multiple timelines, when they activate, will experience catastrophic consciousness fracturing." Chen looked around the lighthouse at the dozens of figures working in rooms that existed outside normal space and time. All those people, missing persons from decades of unexplained disappearances, would be forced back into single timeline existence, their expanded consciousness compressed into forms that couldn't contain it. "It would be like trying to force an ocean back into a teacup," James explained, his form solidifying as he focused on communicating with his niece. "The human mind, once expanded across infinite possibilities, can't survive being crushed back into linear limitations." Agent Thompson's voice echoed from outside, now speaking into what sounded like a field radio. "Command. Subjects are showing signs of integration resistance. Recommend immediate deployment of consciousness compression protocols." Chen felt sick to her stomach. They're not trying to rescue the missing people. They're planning to destroy them. "Worse than that," the keeper said grimly. "The federal project has been deliberately creating temporal instabilities at sites around the world, then harvesting the consciousness fragmentation that occurs when people are forced through traumatic timeline collapse. They've learned to weaponize human suffering on a quantum level." Through the lighthouse walls, Chen could see military personnel setting up additional equipment, devices that hummed with the same frequency as Dr. Vasquez's detector, but amplified to levels that made her teeth ache even from inside the quantum-shielded structure. "Detective Chen," Thompson's voice came through a bullhorn, "you have 30 seconds to exit the anomaly before we initiate forced extraction. Dr. Vasquez, your cooperation is required for national security purposes." Dr. Vasquez looked at her readings with growing horror. "The dampening fields are designed to create a cascade effect. They won't just collapse the quantum consciousness here. They'll destabilize every temporal anchor point globally. Every lighthouse site, every sacred threshold, every place where people have been working to repair space-time damage." "How many people are we talking about?" Chen asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Thousands," James replied, his form flickering as the external dampening fields began to interfere with the lighthouse's quantum stability. "People from 17 sites across 6 continents, all working together to prevent reality from unraveling completely." The keeper moved to a control panel that seemed to blend Victorian brass with cutting-edge quantum technology. "Detective Chen, Dr. Vasquez, I need you to understand what's really at stake here. The federal project isn't just planning to destroy our network of consciousness anchors. They're planning to use the resulting temporal Chaos to power weapons that can rewrite history itself. Chen watched in growing horror as the Keeper activated what appeared to be a holographic display showing the world's 17 lighthouse sites. Each location pulsed with gentle light, connected to the others by streams of energy that formed a global network of temporal stability. Without our anchor network, the Keeper continued, the industrial damage to space-time will cascade beyond control. Not just timeline fragmentation, but complete temporal dissolution. Past, present, and future will collapse into a single moment of infinite possibility. Which sounds beautiful until you realize that infinite possibility includes infinite suffering, infinite death, infinite versions of every trauma that has ever occurred or ever could occur. The military equipment outside was reaching operational frequency. Chen could feel it in her bones, a vibration that seemed to shake apart her very sense of self. Dr. Vasquez was clutching her detector like a lifeline, its readings now showing levels that shouldn't be survivable for human consciousness. 15 seconds until forced extraction, Thompson announced. All personnel prepare for consciousness compression. Chen looked at her uncle, at the Keeper, at the impossible lighthouse filled with people who had sacrificed their linear existence to prevent reality from eating itself alive. Then she looked at Dr. Vasquez, whose scientific mind was clearly processing the implications of everything they'd learned. Doctor, Chen said quietly, if we stay here, if we join the network, can we stop what they're planning? Theoretically, yes. But Detective, joining quantum consciousness means giving up everything that makes you individually human. Your memories, your relationships, your linear identity, all of it becomes part of something larger. Outside, the countdown continued. 10 seconds. 9. 8. James reached out to take his niece's hand, his touch feeling like electricity and starlight, and the weight of infinite possibilities. Sarah, the choice has to be yours. But remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of who you are to protect who others might become. 5. 4. 3. Chen thought about Rebecca waiting at home, about her life in Millhaven, about all the reasons she had to stay in linear existence. But then, she thought about the thousands of people working across time and space to hold reality together, and the federal weapons that would turn temporal chaos into instruments of unimaginable destruction. 2. 1. The dampening fields activated, and Chen felt her consciousness begin to stretch across infinite timelines. But instead of terror, she felt something unexpected. She felt like she was finally coming home. But was she saving the world, or surrendering to the most sophisticated lie ever told? The moment the dampening fields activated, Detective Sarah Chen experienced dying and being born simultaneously across 10,000 different timelines. She was a child in her grandmother's kitchen, an old woman watching the ocean, a version of herself who had never become a police officer, another who had died in a car accident at 23. But instead of madness, she felt an overwhelming sense of completeness, as if she had been living her entire life with only a fraction of her true consciousness. Dr. Vasquez screamed beside her, but the scream existed in multiple octaves across different realities. In one timeline, the physicist embraced the expansion immediately, her scientific mind delighting in the infinite data streams. In another, she fought the quantum dissolution and shattered into incomprehensible fragments. But in this timeline, the one Chen somehow understood was the most important. Vasquez held onto her core identity, while allowing her awareness to expand across the network. Detective! James Rodriguez was suddenly beside them, his form now stabilized into something that looked like all his possible ages at once. The federal team is trying to collapse the entire network. We need to act immediately. Through her expanded consciousness, Chen could perceive the 17 lighthouse sites across the globe as if she were standing in all of them simultaneously. She saw the sacred grove in Scotland, where missing hikers had been joining the network for decades. She saw the ancient pyramid in Mexico, where indigenous shamans had been maintaining temporal stability since before the Spanish conquest. She saw the abandoned oil rig in the North Sea, where petroleum engineers had discovered something far more valuable than fossil fuels. And she saw the federal assault teams moving against all of them at once. "It's a coordinated global strike," the lighthouse keeper explained, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "They've been planning this for years, waiting for maximum, astronomical alignment to maximize the destruction. When they collapse our anchor, points." Chen's expanded awareness showed her the true scope of the federal project's ambition. Military bases around the world were activating consciousness compression weapons, devices designed to weaponize the quantum fragmentation of human awareness. She could see test facilities where volunteers had been subjected to controlled timeline collapse, their shattered minds harvested to power experimental weapons that could rewrite enemy nations' histories. "Dr. Vasquez," Chen called out, her voice somehow reaching across multiple realities. "Can we counter their dampening fields?" "Not directly," the physicist replied, her consciousness now simultaneously calculating possibilities across thousands of potential futures. "But, Detective, I'm seeing something in the quantum mathematics. The federal weapons require stolen consciousness to function. They're parasitic technology that can't sustain itself without harvesting awareness from their victims." Through the lighthouse's quantum-transparent walls, Chen watched Agent Thompson directing the placement of additional equipment. His face was no longer the bland mask of federal authority. It was twisted with desperation and something that might have been guilt. "He knows what he's doing," James observed, his expanded awareness touching his niece's consciousness like gentle rain. "Thompson has been feeding us information about the project's timeline because he wants us to stop it. But he's trapped in a command structure that will kill him if he refuses to follow orders." Chen's consciousness expanded further, and suddenly she could perceive the conversation Thompson was having with his superiors through his radio earpiece. "Command, subjects have achieved quantum integration. Consciousness compression weapons are charging, but I'm reading massive resistance from the network. Agent Thompson, you are authorized to use lethal force if subjects attempt to interfere with containment protocols. The timeline weapons must be tested during this alignment window." "Command, understood. But I need you to know that the collateral damage from full compression will extend far beyond the target sites. We're talking about potential consciousness fragmentation for every human being within a 50-mile radius of each lighthouse location. Acceptable losses for national security. Agent, proceed with compression sequence." Chen felt sick across all her timelines simultaneously. The federal project wasn't just planning to destroy the lighthouse network. They were planning to shatter the minds of millions of innocent people to power their timeline weapons. "We have to stop them," she said, her voice echoing across quantum dimensions. "Detective," the keeper replied, "stopping them will require us to reveal the full extent of our capabilities. Once the governments of the world understand what consciousness expansion truly offers, they'll never stop trying to weaponize it." Through her expanded awareness, Chen could see other possibilities branching out like a tree of infinite choices. In some timelines, they fought the federal project and won, but humanity spent the next century at war over control of consciousness expansion technology. In others, they remained hidden, and the federal weapons succeeded, fracturing reality itself until existence became an endless loop of suffering. In still others, they found third options, possibilities that required sacrifices she wasn't sure she was prepared to make. "There," Dr. Vasquez said suddenly, her quantum-expanded mind processing calculations at the speed of thought. "So, I see a solution, but it's going to require something unprecedented." "What?" "We don't fight the federal weapons. We absorb them. The consciousness compression technology they're using, it's based on our own quantum anchor principles. If we can reverse the polarity during the compression sequence, We can turn their weapons into expansion devices instead. Chen felt the elegance of the solution across all her timelines simultaneously. Instead of resisting the federal attack, they would transform it, turning weapons designed to fragment consciousness into tools that could expand human awareness on a global scale. The risk, James warned, is that expanding consciousness on that scale, that quickly, without proper preparation, it could shatter billions of minds that aren't ready for quantum existence. Or, the Keeper said thoughtfully, it could evolve humanity beyond its current limitations, free every human consciousness from the prison of linear existence. Through the lighthouse walls, Chen could see the federal compression sequence beginning. Military personnel were stepping back from their equipment as massive amounts of energy built up in the consciousness-harvesting devices. In less than 2 minutes, those weapons would fire, attempting to compress the quantum consciousness of thousands of Lighthouse Network members into timeline manipulation tools. Dr. Vasquez, Chen said, if we reverse their polarity, what are the odds of success? 47% chance of successful global consciousness expansion. 33% chance of catastrophic failure resulting in human extinction. 20% chance of partial success with unpredictable consequences. Chen looked at her uncle, at the Keeper, at the hundreds of Lighthouse Network members visible through her expanded awareness. All of them had given up their linear existence to protect reality itself. And now, they had the opportunity to free all of humanity from the limitations of single timeline consciousness, or to accidentally destroy the species in the attempt. 1 minute until compression sequence activation, Thompson announced outside, his voice carrying defeat and desperation in equal measure. Chen felt the weight of choice across every possible future. Save humanity by enslaving it to linear existence, or risk everything on the chance that expanded consciousness was humanity's next evolutionary step. But what if there was a fourth option, one that required her to make the ultimate sacrifice? 30 seconds to compression sequence, Agent Thompson's voice carried across the quantum field. But Chen could hear something else in his transmission, a deliberate delay in his countdown. A man buying precious seconds for reasons his superiors couldn't understand. In her expanded consciousness, Detective Sarah Chen experienced a moment of perfect clarity that existed across all possible timelines simultaneously. She could see every choice, every consequence, every future spreading out like branches of an infinite tree. And in the center of it all, she saw the fourth option, the one that would require her to give up not just her linear existence, but her quantum expansion as well. Dr. Vasquez, she said, her voice somehow reaching across multiple dimensions of reality, what would happen if someone volunteered to serve as a conscious buffer during the polarity reversal? The physicist's expanded awareness immediately grasped the implication. A human consciousness positioned between the compression weapons and the global population could theoretically absorb the chaotic energy discharge. But Detective, the person serving as the buffer, wouldn't survive the process. Their consciousness would be completely dispersed across infinite timelines with no possibility of reintegration. Chen felt her Uncle James's quantum presence touch, her mind like a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sarah, no. There has to be another way. 20 seconds, Thompson announced, but Chen could perceive him through the lighthouse's quantum transparency. His finger was hovering over the abort sequence, waiting for some sign that would justify stopping the operation. There isn't another way, Chen replied, her consciousness already beginning to separate from the Lighthouse Network as she prepared for what came next. If we reverse the polarity without a buffer, billions of unprepared minds will be shattered by sudden consciousness expansion. If we don't reverse it, thousands of network members will be compressed into weapons, and reality itself will eventually unravel. The lighthouse keeper's voice came from everywhere at once. Sam, Detective Chen, what you're proposing has never been attempted. We don't know if it's even theoretically possible for a single consciousness to absorb that much quantum energy. 15 seconds. Chen could see Rebecca through her expanded awareness, her partner sitting at their kitchen table, grading papers and waiting for Chen to come home from another case that had run late. In one timeline, Chen would walk through that door in an hour, hang up her jacket, and complain about federal bureaucrats while Rebecca made tea. In another, Rebecca would wait all night, then file a missing persons report that would never be resolved. But in the timeline that mattered, the one where humanity survived with its consciousness intact, Rebecca would remember Sarah, Chen as someone who had chosen to protect 8 billion people she would never meet. "Dr. Vasquez," Chen said, "I need you to modify the polarity reversal to channel the compression energy through me instead of dispersing it randomly. Can you do that?" 10 seconds. The physicist's quantum-expanded mind was already calculating the necessary modifications. "Yes, but Sarah, you won't just die. You'll be scattered across every possible timeline that ever was or ever could be. Your consciousness will exist everywhere and nowhere, experiencing every possible version of existence simultaneously until it dissolves completely." 5 seconds. Chen thought about her Uncle James, who had walked into the unknown 36 years ago to protect people he loved. She thought about Officer Webb, who had spent decades carrying an impossible story because someone needed to remember the truth. She thought about all the Lighthouse Network members who had given up their linear lives to hold reality together. 3 seconds. "Do it," Chen said. 2 seconds. Dr. Vasquez's quantum consciousness reached out across multiple dimensions, reprogramming the federal compression weapons in the microsecond before they fired. Instead of compressing consciousness into weapons, the devices would channel their energy through Detective Sarah Chen's willingly dispersed awareness. 1 second. Chen felt herself begin to scatter across infinite possibilities. She was every case she had ever solved, and every case she never would solve. She was every conversation with Rebecca, and every conversation that might have been. She was her Uncle James's niece and a stranger who had never heard his name. She was a police officer, a teacher, an artist, a mother, a child, an old woman dying peacefully, a young woman full of dreams. The compression weapons fired. The energy that should have shattered thousands of expanded consciousnesses instead flowed through Chen's dispersing awareness like lightning through a willing conductor. She felt herself becoming the bridge between linear existence and quantum consciousness, absorbing the chaotic transition energy that would have driven unprepared minds insane. Across the globe, 8 billion people experienced a moment of perfect clarity. Not the overwhelming expansion of full quantum consciousness, but a gentle touch of expanded awareness. For just an instant, every human being on Earth could perceive themselves as part of something larger, connected to every other consciousness through threads of compassion and understanding. The Lighthouse Network remained intact, their quantum consciousness preserved and strengthened. The federal weapons, drained of their stolen consciousness energy, shut down permanently. The timeline manipulation project collapsed as its power source dissipated across dimensions of reality that existed beyond government control. And Sarah Chen became everywhere and nowhere. Her consciousness scattered across infinite possibilities like starlight dispersed through an infinite prism. Agent Thompson stood in the rain outside the lighthouse, staring at equipment that showed impossible readings, consciousness compression weapons that had somehow been converted into expansion devices, energy signatures that suggested successful global awareness enhancement, and the complete absence of the quantum consciousness that had been Detective Sarah Chen. In his earpiece, his commanders were screaming for status reports, demanding explanations for equipment failures and asking why the timeline weapons had shut down. But Thompson removed his earpiece and let it fall into the mud, where the voices of his superiors were finally silenced. Dr. Vasquez emerged from the lighthouse, her consciousness still expanded but anchored to linear existence by grief and purpose. The federal project was over, The Global Consciousness Network was safe, and humanity had been given its first taste of expanded awareness without losing its individual identity. But the price had been the complete dissolution of the most dedicated police officer Elena Vasquez had ever met. James Rodriguez appeared beside the physicist, his quantum form flickering with sorrow. "She knew," he said simply. "Sarah knew that someone had to serve as the bridge between what we were and what we could become. She chose to be the sacrifice that would let humanity evolve safely." Through her expanded consciousness, Dr. Vasquez could perceive Chen's dispersed awareness like an echo across infinite timelines. Not gone, exactly, but transformed into something that could never be called back into individual existence. But in that echo, in the consciousness scattered across all possible realities, there was something that might have been peace. Had Sarah Chen saved humanity? Or had she simply found the most heroic way to disappear forever? 3 weeks after the lighthouse incident, Rebecca Martinez sat in the coffee shop where she and Sarah used to meet for lunch, staring at a missing persons report that would never capture the truth of what had happened. The official story was simple. Detective Chen had disappeared during a federal investigation at Beacon Point, presumed deceased due to adverse weather conditions and unstable coastal terrain. Dr. Elena Vasquez entered the coffee shop with the careful movements of someone carrying invisible weight. Her quantum-expanded consciousness allowed her to perceive multiple layers of reality, but it also meant she could see all the versions of this conversation that might unfold, including the ones where Rebecca refused to believe anything beyond the official report. "Ms. Martinez," Dr. Vasquez said, settling into the chair across from Rebecca, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Rebecca looked up with eyes that held the hollow exhaustion of someone who had spent weeks not sleeping. "The FBI agent who interviewed me said Sarah was working with you on some kind of scientific consultation. He said there was an accident." "That's not exactly what happened." Vasquez pulled out a leather journal, Officer Webb's careful documentation of 36 years of impossible observations. "Your partner died saving 8 billion people from something they'll never know existed." The coffee shop around them buzzed with normal life. Students studying, business people conducting meetings, elderly couples sharing afternoon treats. None of them aware that 3 weeks ago they had experienced a moment of expanded consciousness that had quietly changed the fundamental nature of human awareness. Rebecca touched the journal's worn cover. Sarah mentioned Marcus Webb, the old officer who lived on Maple Street. She said he had stories about the lighthouse that was supposed to be demolished decades ago. Those stories were all true. Vasquez opened the journal to a page filled with Webb's meticulous sketches. "Ms. Martinez, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to understand that Sarah died as a hero in the truest sense of the word." Over the next hour, Dr. Vasquez explained everything: the Lighthouse Network, the federal conspiracy, the consciousness expansion technology, and Sarah's final sacrifice. She showed Rebecca the scientific data, Webb's decades of documentation, and the evidence of global changes that were too subtle for most people to notice, but undeniable to anyone who knew what to look for. "The dreams," Rebecca said suddenly. "Everyone's been having the same kinds of dreams since that storm 3 weeks ago. Vivid dreams about lives they never lived, places they've never been. The school counselor said it's probably mass trauma response to the unusual weather, but it's residual consciousness expansion," Vasquez explained. Sarah's sacrifice prevented the chaotic fragmentation that would have destroyed unprepared minds, but it also left everyone with a small taste of quantum awareness. People are dreaming about their alternate timeline selves. Rebecca was quiet for a long time, processing information that challenged everything she thought she understood about reality. "The federal agent who interviewed me, Thompson, he seemed broken, like he was carrying guilt about something bigger than Sarah's disappearance. Agent Thompson disbanded his entire project division the day after the incident. As far as I know, he's submitted reports recommending that all consciousness manipulation research be permanently classified and discontinued. Vasquez pulled out a newspaper clipping. He's also been reassigned to a desk job processing passport applications in Nebraska. The newspaper article was small, buried on page 6 of the national section. Unusual electromagnetic activity recorded at historical sites worldwide. The piece mentioned brief power fluctuations at 17 locations, all sites where lighthouses had once stood. The official explanation involved solar flares and atmospheric disturbances. What about the people who were trapped in the lighthouse network? Rebecca asked. Sarah's uncle, the other missing officers? Vasquez's expression grew thoughtful. They're still there, still working to maintain temporal stability. But now they do it with humanity's unconscious cooperation. The small amount of expanded awareness everyone received means that reality itself is more stable, less prone to the kind of damage that required constant intervention. So, Sarah's sacrifice worked. More than worked. It evolved humanity in a way that makes the old lighthouse guardian system largely unnecessary. People are still mostly living linear lives, but their subconscious minds are now connected to quantum reality in ways that help maintain cosmic balance naturally. Rebecca picked up her coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Is there any way to communicate with her? If she's scattered across infinite timelines? I've been trying for 3 weeks, Vasquez admitted. My quantum consciousness can perceive the echoes of her dispersed awareness, but it's like trying to have a conversation with starlight. She's everywhere and nowhere, experiencing every possible version of existence simultaneously. But she's not suffering? No. If anything, she's experiencing a kind of existence that transcends both suffering and joy. She's become part of the fundamental structure of reality itself. Vasquez reached across the table and touched Rebecca's hand. Ms. Martinez, Sarah knew what she was choosing. In her final moments, she could see every possible future, and she chose the one where you and everyone else got to keep living normal lives in a universe that remained stable and coherent. Outside the coffee shop window, Millhaven looked exactly as it always had, a small coastal town where nothing extraordinary ever happened. The tourists were already returning to Beacon Point, taking selfies at the historic Lighthouse Foundation without realizing they were standing on ground zero of humanity's quiet evolution. There's one more thing, Vasquez said, pulling out a sealed envelope. Officer Webb asked me to give this to you. He said Sarah would have wanted you to have it. Inside the envelope was a letter in Sarah's handwriting, dated the day before the lighthouse incident. Rebecca, if you're reading this, it means I found the answer to Uncle James's disappearance, and the answer required more than I could give while staying in linear existence. I need you to know that every moment we spent together existed across infinite timelines, and in all of them, you made me a better person. Don't mourn what I gave up. Celebrate what we all got to keep. Love, Sarah. Rebecca folded the letter carefully, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Dr. Vasquez, will you help me understand the science behind what Sarah did? I'm not going to pretend this makes sense to me, but I want to learn. I want to understand the choice she made. Of course. Vasquez smiled, recognizing the same determination in Rebecca that had driven Sarah to pursue impossible truths. And Ms. Martinez, Sarah's consciousness may be dispersed across infinite realities, but love transcends dimensional boundaries. Somewhere in the quantum foam, in the space between possibilities, she knows you're proud of her. As they left the coffee shop together, Rebecca could have sworn she felt a familiar presence. Not Sarah exactly, but something that carried the warmth and protection she remembered, like being watched over by someone who existed everywhere at once. But could Rebecca learn to live with a love that existed across infinite timelines? Or would the truth about Sarah's sacrifice become another burden too heavy to carry? 6 months after Detective Sarah Chen scattered herself across infinite timelines, Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in the basement of Millhaven Police. The past year, she had documented 17 similar memorial services around the world, each one honoring the lighthouse guardians who had given up linear existence to prevent temporal collapse. "The reports keep coming in," she said to the assembled group, which now included Agent Thompson, no longer a federal agent, but a civilian consultant helping communities understand the changes they were experiencing. Enhanced creativity in children near former lighthouse sites. Breakthrough innovations in sustainable technology from researchers who report receiving solutions in dreams. International conflicts resolving through unprecedented cooperation. Dr. Vasquez consulted her tablet, showing global consciousness coherence maps that resembled neural networks spanning continents. Sarah's sacrifice created something we never imagined possible, a species-wide upgrade that preserves individual consciousness while enabling collective problem-solving. We're watching human evolution in real time. Margaret Rainsong's voice came through their communication system from similar services being held simultaneously at all 17 sites. "My grandfather would say that Detective Chen became what our stories call a bridge person, someone who sacrifices themselves to connect worlds that were meant to be united. The Lighthouse Network was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to hold things together until humanity was ready to hold them together itself." Thompson, who had spent the past year helping shut down federal consciousness manipulation projects around the world, placed a single white flower beside the badges. "I've seen classified reports from every major government. The consciousness expansion Sarah facilitated has made traditional warfare nearly impossible. Soldiers exposed to enhanced empathy find they can't maintain the psychological disconnection necessary for combat. Politicians report difficulty lying to constituents who unconsciously sense deception." "It's not utopia," Rebecca cautioned, remembering Sarah's dedication to honest investigation even when the truth was uncomfortable. "We're still dealing with corporate interests trying to exploit the consciousness changes, religious extremists claiming the expansion is demonic, and individuals who can't adapt to increased empathy and social connection." Webb nodded grimly. "The New Guardians program has documented 47 attempts to develop consciousness suppression technology in the past year. Some people prefer suffering they understand to healing they can't control. But even as they acknowledged the ongoing challenges, the evidence of positive change was undeniable. Crime rates had dropped dramatically in communities near former lighthouse sites. Environmental restoration projects were succeeding beyond all projections, as people reported feeling personally connected to ecological health. Scientific breakthroughs were accelerating as researchers unconsciously collaborated across traditional disciplinary boundaries. "The most remarkable change," Dr. Vasquez said, pulling up global data on her tablet, "is in children born after the expansion event. They show unprecedented levels of emotional intelligence, creative problem-solving, and what psychologists are calling intuitive empathy. They seem to unconsciously understand that their individual well-being is connected to collective well-being." Rebecca smiled, thinking about her students who had been displaying exactly these traits since returning to school after the lighthouse incident. They collaborated more naturally, showed increased concern for classmates' emotional states, and approached complex problems with the kind of multidimensional thinking that had once required graduate-level training. As the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, casting long shadows across the memorial garden, the small group held a moment of silence for Sarah Chen and all the lighthouse guardians who had sacrificed their linear existence to protect humanity's future. "I still feel her sometimes," Rebecca said quietly, "not as a ghost or a presence, but as if love itself has become more tangible since she dispersed across infinite timelines. As if the universe became slightly more compassionate because of what she chose." Dr. Vasquez nodded. "Quantum consciousness theory suggests that love, like consciousness itself, transcends dimensional boundaries. Sarah's final act wasn't just sacrifice, It was transformation. She became part of the fundamental force that connects all conscious beings across space and time. As the memorial service concluded, each participant placed a small stone on the memorial garden and spoke a brief remembrance. Webb recalled Sarah's dedication to finding truth even when it defied explanation. Thompson honored her courage in facing impossible choices. Margaret Rainsong blessed her as a bridge person whose sacrifice connected worlds. Dr. Vasquez celebrated her willingness to evolve beyond individual existence for collective benefit. Rebecca spoke last, her voice carrying across the garden where lighthouse beams once swept the ocean. Sarah Chen proved that love is stronger than the fear of dissolution. That connection is more powerful than separation, and that sometimes the greatest act of individual heroism is choosing to become part of something larger than yourself. As they walked away from Beacon Point, leaving the memorial garden to bloom under starlight, Rebecca carried with her the knowledge that she was part of a network that spanned the globe. Not the old lighthouse system that required human sacrifice, but something new and unprecedented. Ordinary people using their ordinary lives to protect humanity's quiet evolution toward wisdom, compassion, and collective consciousness. The lighthouse at Beacon Point was gone, demolished by the same forces that had tried to weaponize its power. But the light it had protected, the possibility of human consciousness connected across infinite possibilities, that light now burned in 8 billion hearts, tended by guardians who were teachers and scientists, former federal agents and tribal elders. Anyone willing to use their life to ensure that humanity's evolution served love rather than fear. Detective Sarah Chen's final case would never be officially closed, because the mystery she had died to solve was still unfolding in every human heart that chose connection over isolation, compassion over exploitation, hope over despair. And in the space between possibilities, in the quantum foam where consciousness touches infinite timelines, something that had once been Sarah Chen continued to work, ensuring that the light of human potential would never be extinguished by those who preferred darkness. The case of Badge 471 was closed, but the story it told, of ordinary people capable of extraordinary sacrifice for love, that story was just beginning.